At 13, a frontier girl is cast out in a winter storm after becoming pregnant through violations she's too ashamed to name. She survives, gives birth, is taken in by a compassionate outsider who teaches her to read, argue, and fight injustice. 17 years later, she returns, now the territory's first female judge, to preside over a land and guardianship dispute that drags her estranged parents, her past, and the frontier community's shame back into the light. Will she punish, forgive, or transform them? The first blow was the wind, a physical shove from the plains that stole the breath from her lungs. The second was the heavy oak of the door slamming shut, its final echoing thump a sound more absolute than a gunshot. The latch sliding home was a metallic whisper of damnation. Eliza Rourke, 13 years old and 6 months gone with a secret she could no longer keep, stood on the porch in her thin nightdress as the blizzard raged. Snow, sharp as sand, whipped at her face and bare arms. She turned, pressing her cheek against the frozen wood of the door she was no longer permitted to enter. "Pa!" Her voice was a raw shred of sound, instantly devoured by the storm. "Please!" Inside, she could hear her mother's weeping, a muffled, frantic sound. "Tom, for the love of God, you cannot, she is our child." Thomas Rourke's voice was as hard and unyielding as the frozen earth beneath his ranch. "No harlot under my roof. I have a name in this territory, Mary, a reputation. That ends tonight. She has shamed us. She is no longer our child." Eliza pounded a numb fist against the oak. "Pa! Mama!" She could see them through the small glass pane, a distorted tableau in the flickering lamplight. Her father, a rigid silhouette, his back to the door. Her mother, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. He had built this house, this life, on the foundation of his reputation. A pregnant, unmarried daughter was a crack in that foundation he would not tolerate. He would sooner saw off his own limb. He had just done so. The cold was a predator, sinking its teeth into her flesh. She stumbled off the porch, her bare feet sinking into the fast-deepening snow. The world was a swirling chaos of white and black, the howl of the wind her only companion. She clutched her belly, a protective, futile gesture against the elemental violence. This was the frontier's ultimate judgment, expulsion. To be cast out was a death sentence, slower than a bullet but just as certain. Frontier shame travels farther than a snowstorm, she thought, a phrase she'd heard whispered about other fallen girls. Now it was her own epitaph. She followed the fence line, a ghostly guide in the maelstrom. Each post was a small victory, a point to aim for in the blinding whiteness. The wind tore at her nightdress, the thin cotton offering no more protection than a prayer. One of her feet, already senseless with cold, caught in a hidden drift. She fell, and her worn leather boot, a gift from her father last Christmas, was swallowed by the snow. She scrabbled for it, her fingers clumsy and frozen, but it was gone. She pushed herself up, hobbling now, one foot booted, the other bare. The pain was a distant, academic thing. The cold was everything. She thought of the child inside her, an innocent accomplice to a sin she hadn't understood. The sin wasn't the act itself, a confusing, fumbling moment of fear behind the granary with a trusted ranch hand. The sin was being caught. The sin was the swelling of her belly that made her father's reputation shrink. Her strength gave out by the third fence post from the bend in the creek. Her body simply stopped obeying. She sank to her knees, then pitched forward into a deep drift, the snow a deceptively soft and final embrace. The world narrowed to the frantic pounding of her own heart, a frantic drumbeat slowing to a halt. As darkness rushed in, a single flickering light pierced the blizzard's veil. A lantern, swinging in the gloom, growing brighter. A ghost? An angel? It was the last thing she saw before the cold won. Reverend Amos Rowan was a man accustomed to navigating the territory's darkness, both literal and spiritual. His circuit took him through storms, floods, and the more common tempests of the human heart. His night wagon, packed with Bibles, basic medicines, and copies of territorial statutes, was a mobile outpost of civilization. It was the low groan of his horse Solomon that alerted him. The animal had stopped, head raised, ears twitching against the wind's assault. "What is it, old friend?" Amos peered out, his lantern held high. The light cut a small, golden circle in the roaring dark. At first, he saw nothing but a mound of snow against the Rourke's fence line. Then the mound moved. He was out of the wagon in an instant, wading through the thigh-deep drifts. He knelt, sweeping the snow away. It was a girl, barely a child, her face blue-white, a filigree of ice in her hair. He recognized her instantly. Eliza, Thomas Rourke's girl. He had seen her at Sunday gatherings, a bright, shy thing who always hid behind her mother's skirts. He touched her neck, a pulse, faint and thready but there. "Lord, have mercy," he breathed, the words turning to frost. He saw the swell of her belly beneath the frozen nightdress. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He had seen this particular brand of paternal pride and cruelty before. Thomas Rourke, a man who would sacrifice his own blood to protect his standing. With a grunt, Amos lifted Eliza into his arms. She was terrifyingly light. He carried her back to the wagon, laying her on a bed of heavy wool blankets in the back. He worked quickly, stripping off the frozen, useless nightdress and wrapping her shivering body in the driest blankets he had. He rubbed her hands and feet, his movements brisk but gentle, forcing life back into her limbs. He guided the wagon not towards town, but towards his own small, isolated mission shed, a mile down the creek. A place of quiet sanctuary, far from the judgmental eyes of Rourke's Crossing. The mission shed was humble. One room with a pot-bellied stove, a cot, and shelves overflowing with books. He got the stove roaring, the heat slowly pushing back the killing cold. As warmth returned to Eliza's body, a different kind of agony began. Her eyes fluttered open, wide with fear and pain. A low moan escaped her lips and she curled into herself, her hands flying to her stomach. "The child," she gasped, "it's coming." Amos, who had midwifed more souls into the next world than babies into this one, knew he was out of his depth, but he was all she had. He boiled water, tore strips from clean linen, and spoke to her in a low, calming voice, quoting psalms and offering words of encouragement. The birth was a brutal, desperate struggle in the flickering lamplight. Eliza's cries were muffled by the still howling wind, a secret agony contained within the four walls of the shed. The baby, a boy, arrived just before dawn, small and terrifyingly fragile. He was too early, his lungs too weak to draw a full breath. He let out a cry like the mew of a kitten, a sound of heartbreaking struggle. Amos baptized him right there, with a drop of melted snow. "I name thee Samuel," he whispered, his voice thick. Eliza, exhausted and hollowed out, held the tiny bundled infant to her chest. She felt his faint warmth, his shallow breaths. For a few precious hours, she was a mother. She looked at his perfect miniature face and saw not shame, but a profound, aching love. As the morning sun cast a pale gray light through the shed's single window, the baby's struggle ceased. Samuel died in his mother's arms. They buried him on the small hill behind the shed, under a lone pine tree. There was no headstone, just a flat, unmarked river stone to mark the place. The grief that washed over Eliza was a silent, empty ocean. It scoured her clean of tears, of fear, of everything but a vast, hollow ache. Back in the shed, as the storm finally broke, she sat staring into the fire. Reverend Rowan sat with her, his presence a quiet anchor in her sea of loss. "Eliza," he said gently, "who did this to you? Whose hand forced your father's?" Her voice was a dead whisper, the sound of ash. She spoke a name. An older ranch hand, a man who had worked for her father for years, a man who had always been kind to her, who had given her candy and called her his favorite. A family ally, a wolf her father had kept by his own hearth. Amos's face hardened, but his voice remained gentle. "Thomas knows?" She nodded, not looking at him. "He knows," he said bringing it to light would ruin the farm. The man's family's connected. It would be my word against his, a ruined girl's word. Her father had chosen the farm over her, over the truth. Amos was silent for a long time. The law of the territory was a blunt instrument, and it rarely favored a girl in her position. An affidavit, a public accusation. It would become a spectacle of shame that would destroy her and likely change nothing. Her father had made a cold calculation. Eliza stood up. She took the ruined nightdress she had been cast out in, the one Amos had dried by the fire. It was stiff with frozen mud and memory. Without a word, she walked to the stove, opened the iron door, and thrust it into the flames. The thin cotton caught instantly, flaring into a bright, consuming fire. She watched it burn to black cinders, her face illuminated, impassive. It was a baptism of fire, a symbolic severance. The girl who had worn that dress was gone, turned to ash with it. Rowan watched her, his heart aching with a mixture of pity and awe. He saw not a broken child, but a piece of tempered steel being forged in the crucible of unimaginable pain. When she turned back from the fire, her eyes were dry and hard. "What now?" she asked. The question was not a plea for help, it was a demand for a direction. Rowan made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. He saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the stubborn will to survive. "You are a ghost now, Eliza Rourke," he said softly. "Your father has willed you gone. So be it. But ghosts can learn to haunt the living in ways they never expect." He gestured to the shelves of books. "Stay here. Work for me. Keep this mission. Tend the fire. Cook the meals. And in return, I will teach you. First, letters. Then numbers. Then scripture. And then," he paused, his gaze intense, "I will teach you the law. Contracts, deeds, statutes. I will teach you how to make the law answer for what men like your father will not. You will build a new name, one that cannot be taken from you." Eliza looked at the books, their leather spines like a row of silent soldiers. She looked at the unmarked grave on the hill. She looked at the ashes of her old life in the stove. There was no softness left in her, no room for tears. There was only a cold, hard resolve. She gave a single, sharp nod. "I will stay." She met his eyes. "My name is Eliza, just Eliza." He understood. He extended a hand. "Then welcome, Eliza. My name is Rowan. You can share it if you have a mind to. A name is a start." She did not take his hand, but she held his gaze. In the silence of the shed, a bargain was struck. Not of faith, not of charity, but of survival and the slow, patient promise of a future reckoning. The first letter Eliza learned to form was the letter E. She traced it in the soot on the back of the stove with a trembling finger. E for Eliza. Reverend Rowan sat beside her, his large, patient hand guiding hers. The world, which had been a fog of symbols and sounds, slowly began to resolve itself into sharp, meaningful shapes. She learned to read the names on feed sacks, the titles of the books on Rowan's shelves, the dense, spidery script of the Holy Bible. Her hunger for knowledge was ferocious. It was a tool, a weapon, a shield. Rowan quickly moved her from scripture to ledgers. She learned to tally accounts, to track supplies, to understand the flow of goods and money that was the lifeblood of the territory. "Look here, Eliza," Rowan said one afternoon, spreading a document on the rough-hewn table. "This is an oxen lease. Mr. Abernathy leases 2 of his beasts to Mr. Schmidt for the spring plowing. See this clause? Said oxen to be returned in good health, ordinary wear and tear accepted." Abernathy wrote that. But Schmidt, who cannot read, just made his mark. "What if one of the oxen breaks a leg?" Eliza asked, her brow furrowed. "Abernathy will claim it wasn't ordinary wear. He'll demand Schmidt pay for the beast. Schmidt, with only his mark on this paper, has no recourse. Words on paper, Eliza, have more power than a sidearm if you know how to wield them. But they can also be a cage for those who don't understand them." He showed her how to draft a better clause, one that specified terms that protected both parties. He showed her how ink could build a fence stronger than any split rail. She saw that law wasn't an abstract concept from a distant government. It was the invisible architecture of their lives. And those who could read the plans held all the power. Her first real test came a year later, and it ended in bitter failure. A family named Gavel, newly arrived and recently orphaned, had their small herd of goats seized by a powerful rancher, a man named Sterling, over a supposed debt their deceased father owed. The Gavels had 2 children, a boy of 10 and a girl of 8, with eyes wide with terror. They reminded Eliza so much of herself. She went with Rowan to mediate. Sterling produced a ledger with a tally mark against the Gable name. He owed me for winter feed, Sterling said, his voice slick with false confidence. The goats cover the debt. Eliza, barely 15 but with Rowan's lessons burning in her mind, examined the ledger. The ink was newer than the entries around it. The tally mark was cramped, forced into a space it didn't belong in. This tally was added recently, she stated, her voice clear and steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The ledger is forged. Sterling laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. And who are you? The preacher's scullery maid? The law is the law. A debt is a debt. He turned to the timid territorial agent who had accompanied them. Are you going to listen to this girl or to my ledger? The agent, intimidated by Sterling's wealth and influence, sided with the rancher. The goats were driven away. The Gable children stood, powerless and weeping, as their only livelihood was stolen from them. The image of their faces, streaked with dirt and tears, seared itself into Eliza's mind. She saw her own reflection in their helplessness. She saw the ghost of her baby, of a life stolen by a powerful man and a lie. That evening she walked to the hill behind the mission. She stood before the unmarked riverstone that covered Samuel's grave. The pain of that night, usually a dull, persistent ache, was sharp and fresh. The injustice done to the Gable children had torn the scab off her own wound. She placed a hand on the cold stone. I couldn't help them, she whispered to the silent ground. I wasn't strong enough. My words weren't enough. She looked out at the vast, indifferent landscape. But I will be, she vowed, her voice gaining strength. A promise made to the son she couldn't save and the children she couldn't protect. I swear on your memory I will learn the words that are stronger than their guns and their lies. I will become the law that shelters the next child forced out. The next family cheated, I will not fail again. That oath became her crucible. For the next decade she was Rowan's shadow, his clerk, his apprentice. They rode the circuit together, a familiar sight across the sprawling territory. She, a quiet, stern-faced young woman on a sturdy mare, and he, the aging reverend in his dusty wagon. Her role grew with every settlement they visited. At first, she merely drafted receipts. Then she was translating complex land deeds for German immigrants. Soon she was mediating small disputes herself, water rights between farmers, boundary arguments, breaches of contract. She never raised her voice. She simply produced the written agreement, the clear clause, the undeniable logic of the law, as Rowan had taught her. She won respect, not with charisma, but with competence. They started calling her Rowan's girl, then just Rowan's clerk. Her reputation was a quiet, creeping vine, growing steadily in the background of the territory's noisy expansion. The moment of her transformation, her public birth, came during a sweltering August tent hearing in a new settlement called Prosperity Flats. The dispute was over water rights to the Serenity River, pitting a dozen small homesteaders against two cattle barons who had dammed a tributary upstream, choking the flow to a trickle. The official magistrate was drunk, as he often was. The hearing was a chaotic shouting match. Reverend Rowan was asked to mediate. He stood and calmed the crowd, then said, "My clerk, Miss Eliza, has reviewed the original territorial water share agreements. She has found a point of order." A ripple of murmurs went through the tent. All eyes fell on Eliza, now 24, standing beside Rowan. She was dressed simply, but her posture was ramrod straight. One of the cattle barons, a florid man named McCoy, sneered, "We're not taking legal advice from a preacher's secretary." Eliza didn't flinch. She stepped forward, holding a sheaf of papers. "The issue is not the primary agreement, Mr. McCoy, which you have followed. The issue is the Amendment of '78 attached to the Territorial Charter, specifically the downstream parity clause, which states that any impediment constructed for agricultural or livestock purposes must not reduce water flow to established downstream homesteads by more than 20% during the dry season." Her voice was cool and precise, cutting through the hot, dusty air. "My measurements from yesterday, witnessed by 3 homesteaders, show a reduction of 67%. She had them. The clause was obscure, buried deep in the territorial archives Rowan had insisted they copy years ago. McCoy and his partner were speechless. The homesteaders, who had been on the verge of ruin, erupted in a cheer. The drunken magistrate, startled into coherence, had no choice but to rule in their favor. As the tent emptied, Reverend Rowan placed a hand on Eliza's shoulder. His voice boomed, loud enough for the remaining settlers to hear. I tell you all, this territory has no sharper legal mind than this young woman. She is my right hand, not in faith but in law. She is Eliza Rowan. He had given her his name publicly, anointing her. In that moment, she accepted it fully. She was no longer just Eliza. She was Eliza Rowan. She could not retreat now. Her new prominence brought new challenges. Men in saloons would mock the preacher's girl lawyer. A crudely drawn caricature of her was nailed to the mission door. One night, a former associate of the rancher Sterling tried to smear her in a bar, slurring, "Ask her where she was that winter of '68. Ask her what she was hiding in the preacher's shed." Before anyone could react, Rowan, who happened to be there buying supplies, stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He fixed the man with a look of cold, righteous fury. "You will not speak of her past," he said, his voice a low thunder. "You are a man of low character attempting to defame a woman whose integrity is worth more than every acre you and your drunken friends possess. Speak her name again without respect, and I will bring a suit of slander against you that will strip you of your last dollar. Is that understood?" The man, cowed by the iron in the Reverend's voice, shrank away. Despite the resistance, her client list grew. Settlers, farmers, widows, they came to her because she got results. She saved them from foreclosure, she secured their water, she ensured they weren't cheated on taxes. She was honest, meticulous, and cheap. Then, the Great Flood of '85 changed everything. The territorial magistrate, the same drunken official from the tent hearing, was swept away with his house when the Serenity River broke its banks. The territory was suddenly without its highest legal authority. The council in the capital was in a panic. A replacement from back east was months away. Lawlessness was already bubbling up at the edges of the settlements. A petition began to circulate, started by the very homesteaders she had saved at Prosperity Flats. It was simple and direct. "We need a judge now. Let Rowan's girl judge. She reads the law. She speaks the law. She is fair." It gathered hundreds of signatures. The council, under pressure and with few other options, there was a dearth of formally trained and sober legal minds on the frontier, made an expedient, almost revolutionary choice. They appointed Eliza Rowan as the acting circuit judge for the Northern Territories. When the letter of appointment arrived, carried by an exhausted writer, Eliza stared at it, her hand trembling slightly. A judge. The weight of it felt impossible. The irony was suffocating. "I cannot," she whispered to Rowan. I was." Rowan took the letter from her. His eyes, now clouded with age but still bright with conviction, met hers. "You are who you have made yourself to be, Eliza, not what was done to you." He tapped the official seal on the document. "This is not about you. This is about the Gable children. It is about every person who has no one to speak for them." He looked at her, his voice softening. "Somebody's daughter needed a law that would listen. Now you can be the one to write it. You must accept." She thought of the cold night, the slam of the door, the unmarked grave on the hill. She thought of her vow. This was the fulfillment of it. This was the weapon she had spent 17 years forging. She straightened her shoulders, the hesitation falling away, replaced by the familiar, cold resolve. "I accept." 17 years. It was a lifetime. As Judge Eliza Rowan rode her horse over the familiar ridgeline, the territory of her childhood spread out below her. Rourke's Crossing. It looked the same. The ribbon of creek, the cluster of buildings, the vast checkerboard of fenced-in land. But she was not the same. The land that had expelled a terrified, pregnant girl was now being entered by the highest legal authority it knew. Her heart, an organ she had long trained to be a quiet and efficient servant to her mind, beat a frantic, rebellious tattoo against her ribs. She wore a long, dark duster over a simple but well-made dress, her hair pinned up severely. No one would recognize her. The name Rowan was known here, but it was tied to the old preacher, not to a long-vanished daughter. She had made sure of that. Her first circuit as acting judge. The docket had been sent ahead. She'd read it in her tent the night before, her face impassive, while inside a storm raged that rivaled the one from that long-ago winter night. Case 25 T04, Thomas Rourke versus the estate of Lydia Pike. Plaintiff, Thomas Rourke, her father. Defendant, the widow of a man who had been his neighbor. The dispute, a winter grazing deed. A deed signed and dated in the late autumn of 1868, the year she was exiled. She entered the town, her face a mask of judicial neutrality. The temporary courtroom was set up in the town hall, a large room that smelled of sawdust and anxious sweat. She took her place behind a heavy pine table set on a low dais. The gavel, a simple block of wood, felt impossibly heavy in her hand. She did not look at the plaintiff's side of the room. She could feel his presence, a weight in the air. She called the court to order, her voice even and clear. When she finally allowed her gaze to sweep over him, she felt a jolt. Thomas Rourke was an old man. His hair was white, his shoulders stooped. The unbending iron of his posture had begun to rust, but his eyes were the same, hard, proud, and accustomed to being obeyed. Beside him sat her mother, Mary Rourke. Her hair was a web of silver, her face a road map of quiet grief. She clutched a worn Bible in her lap, her knuckles white. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and Eliza saw only the confused gaze of a woman looking at a stranger in a position of power. There was no recognition, not yet. "This court calls the case of Rourke versus the estate of Pike," Eliza announced. Thomas Rourke, represented by a slick young lawyer from the capital, argued his case. He claimed that the widow Pike's sheep were grazing on a section of winter range that was rightfully his, based on a deed securing him primary rights. He produced the document, an aging piece of parchment. "The deed is clear, Your Honor," the lawyer said confidently. "Mr. Rourke's claim is absolute." Eliza examined the document. She then turned to the defendant, the widow Pike. Mrs. Pike was a frail but defiant woman, her eyes red-rimmed but her chin held high. Her defense was simple. "My husband Jedediah worked that land his whole life. He told me it was ours for winter grazing. He said Mr. Rourke only had conditional rights." "A condition?" Eliza asked, her voice dangerously soft. "What condition?" He said Mr. Rourke's right to that extra parcel was granted by a territorial land credit, a credit he only qualified for because he had no other heirs to provide for. A murmur went through the courtroom. Thomas Rourke's face darkened. His lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection! Hearsay! The ramblings of a dead man." "Overruled," Eliza said, her eyes fixed on her father. "The court is interested in the foundation of this deed. Mr. Rourke, you signed an affidavit to secure that land credit, did you not? An affidavit filed with the Territorial Land Office in the winter of '68? "I signed what was required," Thomas snapped, his composure cracking. "And what did that affidavit state?" Eliza pressed. "It stated the truth, that my land holdings were not to be divided, that I had no other heirs to consider." No other heirs to consider. The words were a physical blow. He had not just cast her out, he had erased her from legal existence. He had traded her for a few extra acres of winter grazing. "Mrs. Rourke," Eliza said, turning her attention to her mother. The room fell silent. "Please take the stand." Mary Rourke looked at her husband, who gave a slight, sharp shake of his head. But the command had come from the bench. Trembling, Mary made her way to the witness chair. "Mrs. Rourke," Eliza began, her voice softening almost imperceptibly, "I ask you to think back to that year, 1868. Under oath, can you tell this court how many children you had at that time?" Mary began to tremble violently. She stared at Eliza, a dawning horror and confusion in her eyes. There was something in the judge's cadence, in the line of her jaw, that was stirring a 17-year-old memory. We had our son Jacob, who passed from fever the year before." Her voice trailed off. "And did you have any other children, Mrs. Rourke? Did you have a daughter?" Tears streamed down Mary's face. She looked from her husband's furious glare to the judge's implacable gaze. We had a daughter once," she whispered, the words a confession that had been trapped in her heart for nearly 2 decades. The crowd gasped. "Thank you, Mrs. Rourke. You may step down." Eliza felt a tremor in her own hands, but her voice remained like steel. "This court has in its possession a copy of the circuit preacher's ledger from that year. Reverend Amos Rowan, whose meticulous records are well known in this territory." She held up a book. "He kept a family roll for every settlement. It lists Thomas and Mary Rourke as having one daughter, a girl named Eliza." She paused, letting the weight of the name settle in the room. She looked directly at her father. And it has a second entry, an affidavit sworn by you, Thomas Rourke, and filed with the land office. An affidavit in which you declared you had no surviving female heirs, thereby qualifying you for the credit that secured you this deed. The truth was out. Not the whole truth, but the part the law cared about. Thomas Rourke had committed perjury. He had lied under oath to gain land. His precious reputation was turning to dust before the very town he sought to dominate. Eliza stood. The room was so quiet she could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. She began her final address, her bench monologue, the speech she had been writing in her soul for 17 years. There is the law written on paper, and there is the law of right and wrong. Often, they are not the same. But the purpose of a court, the purpose of a judge, is to bind them together where we can. The law is not merely a tool for the powerful to acquire more power. It is meant to be a shield for the vulnerable. It exists for those who have been wronged, for those with no voice, for those run from warm doors into cold nights. Her eyes bored into her father. An affidavit is a sacred oath. To falsify one for personal gain, to erase a life for a patch of grass, is an offense not just against the territory, but against the very idea of community. A community cannot stand on a bedrock of lies. She drew a deep breath and delivered her judgment. This court finds the deed to the disputed winter range was secured through a fraudulent affidavit. Therefore, the deed is null and void. The original grazing rights stand with the estate of Pike. Furthermore, a penalty is assessed against the plaintiff, Thomas Rourke, in the amount of $500, the estimated value of the land credit he fraudulently obtained. That fine, she added, her voice ringing with authority, will be used to establish a fund for the schooling of daughters in this county, specifically for those who may find themselves cast off or disowned. She struck the gavel. The sound cracked through the stunned silence. Finally, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, this court will draft a statute to be put before the Territorial Council. A statute making it explicit that daughters, even when disowned, shall retain their status as lawful heirs for the purposes of all territorial land grants and inheritance law. A door closed by a father will not be a door closed by the law. This court is adjourned. As the room erupted in a tumult of shocked whispers, Eliza looked at her mother. Mary was openly sobbing, her hand over her mouth, her eyes locked on Eliza's. The recognition was absolute now. Thomas Rourke sat slumped in his chair, a broken man, his face gray. He had been judged, not by a stranger, but by the ghost he had created. Slowly, deliberately, Eliza pulled off her right leather glove. She held up her hand, turning it slightly so her mother could see. On the palm, near the thumb, was a thin, white, crescent-shaped scar. A scar she'd gotten when she was 7, when she'd fallen from the barn loft onto a piece of sharpened tin her father had left behind. Mary had held her and cried, telling her it would always be their little secret mark. Mary's sob became a choked cry of anguish. It was her. It was Eliza. Eliza held her gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement of a shared and sorrowful history. Then, she turned and strode from the dais, her duty done. She didn't wait. She went straight to the livery to collect her horse. As she was tightening the saddle cinch, a hesitant voice spoke her name. Eliza? It was her mother, standing alone by the stable door. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. The two women faced each other in the dusty afternoon light. There were no easy words for a 17-year chasm of pain and silence. Mary stepped forward and simply opened her arms. After a moment's hesitation, Eliza stepped into the embrace. It was awkward at first. Then she felt the familiar frailness of her mother's frame, and a part of the frozen wall around her own heart began to melt. They didn't speak of the past, of the baby, of the reasons. They just held each other, two survivors of Thomas Rourke's pride, and wept. For the girl who was lost, for the woman who had returned, and for the years that could never be recovered. When they parted, Mary pressed a small, worn locket into her hand. I kept it for you. Eliza nodded, clutching it tightly. She mounted her horse. From across the street, she saw her father watching from the shadow of the courthouse. He didn't approach. He just stood there, a man undone by his own legacy, watching his judgment ride away. As Eliza spurred her horse and left Rourke's crossing behind her, a few soft flakes of snow began to fall. Not a blizzard this time, just a gentle, cleansing fall, heralding the coming of a new season. Behind her, the doors of the courthouse were being opened, letting in the fresh, cold air. Ahead of her was the law, and the long road of her own making.